It's nice to see a bunch of new faces here today. It's awesome. And today we are going to talk about an area that's interesting. I just taught my recreation and tourism course today. We have one of you made it, extra marks, bonus marks. And our speaker today is Dr. Rachel Herron from my own department in Geography and Environment. Dr. Herron is professor in Department of Geography and Environment, as I just said, a passionate health geographer. She holds a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Rural and Remote Mental Health, and she's the founding director of the Centre for Critical Studies of Rural and Mental Health at Brandon University. Rachel works with researchers, students, and community partners, as you can see here, to address rural mental health, aging, and care needs. Her research projects ultimately aim to make the places we live more supportive of good mental health and well-being. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rachel, and then there'll be a question period at the end. We'll see if there's any questions online, or I will bring a microphone to you. Okay?
All right. So thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for making the time. I know that every time is a busy time of year, so thanks for taking the hour to be with us, to listen. I'll try to make it as engaging as possible. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that the city of Brandon is located on Treaty 2 land, and so this continues to be a gathering place for diverse Indigenous people, including the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Red River Métis Nation. And so we acknowledge that this is Treaty 2 land, and without the treaties, we really couldn't be doing teaching and research here today. And also that without the care of Indigenous people for this land, we couldn't be doing this research and teaching today. And since we're talking about land, we're talking about public space in this presentation, I think it's really important that we start with recognizing the stewardship of Indigenous people and also what we can learn from Indigenous teachings that might help us to live in better ways with our environment. So I also want to acknowledge that while any errors or omissions throughout this presentation are entirely my fault, there is a team of people who have made the project that I'm about to present to you possible, right? So I want to talk a bit about the project and the opportunity that really helped this project happen. So I want to blame Grant Hamilton, who I think maybe in November of 2022, maybe it was late October, reached out to me, and he had seen a funding opportunity from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research on healthy urban policy. You might have noticed in the introduction that I'm a rural geographer by trade. I'm interested in health, but I usually focus on the area outside the city. And so he reached out to me and he said, there's this great funding opportunity, and we have to bring together the mayor, the chief city planner, a medical officer of health, one health researcher, and the team was kind of set that you could have. And he's like, who else could do this? This is a project built for Brandon. We can do this, right? And he was, of course, really passionate about active transportation, which is a big part of this funding opportunity, and I'll talk a bit more about, because Grant has unfortunately been hit by a car while riding his bike in Brandon. And he's used this experience. If you want to Google Grant Hamilton, you'll come up with a whole bunch of stuff, I'm sure. He's used this experience, I think, for good in terms of trying to promote ways that we might prevent injury and promote safety and have better dialogue between those who drive cars and those who ride bikes and maybe those who do both. So it's Grant's fault. He made some kind of joke about throwing him under the bus, but I can't because he's already gone over the hood. I didn't deliver that as well as Grant would. So we're really fortunate, and I want to thank the mayor for attending today. The mayor was enthusiastic to join this opportunity and saw what we could do, as well as Ryan Nickel, who's the director of planning, and Amy Frykota, Dr. Amy Frykota, who's a medical officer of health. So we had the initial team together, and of course, part of applying for grants is also to provide really great training opportunities for students at Brandon University. And so we've been really fortunate to be able to hire 2 students. One, Jared Friesen, who's actually no longer at Brandon University, but he's gone on to study urban planning at Dalhousie University. So he continues to work with us on this project from a distance. And Madeline Pryke, who's a grad of the psychology department here at Brandon University. So we have psychology meets geography, and they're a really great team together. So before I talk more about active transportation in public space, I just wanted to take this opportunity. I like to take any opportunity that I have to actually tell people what geography is and what health geography is. Because as the introduction explained, I'm a health geographer, a passionate health geographer. Well, what the heck is that? Lots of people think that geography is coloring between the lines, right? That's what you did in high school. You put some capital cities on a map and you colored, right? Or maybe that was middle school or whatever. You didn't necessarily get an introduction to all the things that geography is. And so geographers are really interested in the relationship between where we live and our environments. And health geographers take that further or focus that more specifically on the relationship between where we live and our health. And so they argue that our health and our geographies are inextricably linked to one another. So our health is influenced by the resources around us in our home, in our neighborhood, in our city, in our province, in our country, so across multiple scales. It could be health promoting resources like parks. It could be our health is influenced by access to healthcare. Our health is influenced by environmental contaminants. Our health is influenced by therapeutic environments or places that make us feel good. We often look at Dr. John Snow as kind of the father of medical or health geography, also often cited as the father of epidemiology. And so what did he do? He looked at the cases of cholera in London in the 1850s. At this time, we didn't know what was causing cholera. He plotted them on a map. He was able to find, the water source that these cases shared, and thus render the fecal contaminated pump inoperable. And so there's this kind of great public health intervention associated with this health geography. So today, we also study health promoting places, not just what makes us sick, but also what is it that can help prevent us from being sick. And public spaces and active transportation are a major part of that. So what do I mean by public space? When I'm talking about public space, I'm talking about space that's open to the public, space that can promote hopefully a more just and healthy city. Ultimately, its functions involve promoting meeting people or social connection, which we know. Dr. Newell is sitting here. She knows a lot about social connection and trying to avoid loneliness and isolation, and why that's important for our mental health and our physical health as well. And then they can support movement, things like active transportation. So when I say the words active transportation, I mean moving under your own power. So that could be using a wheelchair, that could be walking, that could be biking. It is not using a car. So I have a few pictures of public spaces. I have Rideau Park, of course, a public space that's one of my favorites. I associate it with walking my dog. For a while, also, we had Colombian Independence Day there, which my husband's a big part of. So there's lots of different functions on a daily basis, some celebratory functions, lots of things that we do. People toboggan there, people swing there, swim there. So lots of different functions in these public spaces. And then I have a picture of Springer Market Square in Kingston, Ontario, which is where I did my PhD. And I thought it was a really good example because while I mentioned meeting and moving as major functions of public space, markets have also traditionally been major functions of public space as well. And so there's often, I think at least twice a week, there's a market in the square. And then in the winter, they use it for skating. In the summer, and the skating is free. And in the summer, they also set up a big movie screen and everybody brings out their lawn chairs and they watch movies for free. So just some examples of public space. What are they for? And what do I mean by public space and active transportation? So just to apply this and make sure you got it, does anyone want to share their favorite public space in Brandon? Keeners, come on.
Riverbank Discovery Center.
Excellent.
Across the river, go further past the co-op. A small set of trails that extends the riverbank. 100 acres of just wilderness. Barely been known, but it exploded during COVID. Highly.
Awesome.
It's an hour-long walk from water. Really, really wild things.
Awesome. So I'm seeing lots of lovers of the riverbank. Dean's very happy. All right. So we get it. We know what we're talking about. So why care? Well, generally speaking, public space and active transportation are promoted as sort of a solution for the health of people and our planet. Why is that? Public space and using more active transportation is associated with improvements in air quality. And poorer air quality is conversely associated with all causes of mortality, cardiovascular disease, breast and prostate cancers. And so from a public health or people health perspective, we certainly want to improve air quality and in doing so, improve health as well. We want to try to make things safe and reduce motor vehicle injuries. We also want to address in climate change and have some opportunities to mitigate that and to support greater social connection and promote better mental health. So it's not just about our physical health, but also better mental health. And one of the things that we know, and I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really borne out, is that often the impacts of the negative health impacts associated with, for example, air pollution are borne unevenly, right? Those people who can't afford a car and have to walk and have to cycle and don't have other choices often kind of bear the negative side of poor air quality. And then conversely, when we build active transportation interventions, what a lot of research has found is that that often just improves the health of those who are already more educated, healthier, younger, and have higher incomes, right? So it's actually exacerbating health inequalities when what we want to do is to try to build public health interventions that try to even the playing field and promote more choices for everyone. So a big part of our interest in active transportation and public space is trying to promote health equity and taking this equity lens rather than believing, okay, if you build it, they will come, which that kind of field of dreams idea doesn't really take into consideration the diverse needs and interests of different groups and that we're all positioned differently in this landscape. Okay, so with this background information, we embarked on kind of a community engagement project. And the objectives of our community engagement project were to explore how people in Brandon move through and experience public space, what gaps and needs exist, and how they influence these different groups. So we took sort of an intersectional analysis, so trying to figure out how people of different ages, of different races, of different genders, and so forth, how they experience Brandon and its public spaces, and then how can we actually improve the health of all of these groups by implementing practices or sharing practices from global leaders and exploring their transferability, right? So part of this funding opportunity was to send us to Copenhagen to participate in a workshop. But we felt it was really important that this project be less about Copenhagen and more about Brandon and what Brandon can learn and what Brandon can bring back. And so before we even went to this workshop, we started to engage with a group of knowledge users, or who we see as local experts in working with diverse populations. And so we assembled a knowledge user advisory committee. And so that included partners like the Brandon Neighborhood Renewal Corporation. And I just realized, Dean, I don't have you on here. This is a horrible mistake. I'm sorry. I have 2 pictures of the Riverbank Discovery Center, and I don't have the Riverbank Discovery Center on this list because I took our original list. All errors and omissions, remember, they're on me. So the Brandon Neighborhood Renewal Corporation was one of our knowledge user advisory committee. We also spoke with Susie McPherson-Durendi as an Indigenous knowledge keeper. We reached out to Brandon Friendship Center, and they actually referred us to Manitoba Harm Reduction Network, which I think was a brilliant idea and hadn't been in my initial thoughts. But I think often when we talk about public spaces, we see substance use as a problem in public spaces, and we don't see substance use as part of the solution. And so this has been a really exciting opportunity for us to actually engage this group in part of planning and building solutions. Obviously, Prairie Mountain Health, we worked with Seniors for Seniors and Age Friendly, and the Sexual Education Resource Centre and Westman Immigrant Services. We reached out to people in a number of different ways. Before we went to Copenhagen, we had a social media campaign and we posted questions on social media. Jared Friesen wore a t-shirt like this, and he went to various parks all summer long. And he met people who are actually actively using public space and handed out a little kind of post-it note for them to go to our survey and directed them to that. And then we also hosted some very targeted focus groups. Why take multiple methods? Well, I think the demographics that are engaged in our different methods actually speak to why you have to use different methods. If you look at the survey, yeah, you can reach a lot of people through a survey online, but many of these people, interestingly, actually were middle-aged and older. The majority or more of them were women. This is not uncommon in social science research. The majority were white, and many were actually very highly educated, having not only a university degree, but I think almost a third of them had a graduate degree. And so this is not getting at the population that we wanted to get at, which is why we engaged our Knowledge User Advisory Committee in developing focus groups that might make a space that's safe for different groups to actually participate. And so when you look at our demographics for our focus group, we have a much more kind of racially diverse composition. We also had an opportunity to engage youth specifically. So we made a youth focus group, being really important since a lot of youth don't have a car or can't legally drive. And so they actually have to get around through active transportation in a lot of cases. And we were also able to engage those with a high school education or less. So important opportunities for us to use the right method to actually find and engage people from different backgrounds. So from the survey, we certainly saw lots of forms of recreational use. People talked about walking and biking and using a scooter and getting around in a range of different ways. They talked about using public spaces for picnicking, for connecting with the land, for Tai Chi, And I thought it was really interesting, although the objective of our survey wasn't necessarily to quantify everything, it was really to start this community engagement process. I thought it was interesting that those who did respond to our survey, or of those who did respond to our survey, 17% of them were actually using walking and biking for the purpose of getting to either their groceries or their work or to attend events. So this kind of like purposeful active transportation, not just active transportation for recreation and leisure, but actually using it to get around. And then many participants actually wanted to do more of this, but they noted that there were problems with safety, a lack of connectivity in our kind of active transportation networks, and the need for the network to be more family friendly, accessible, and multi-use. So this is the kind of common language that we pulled out of the survey. And here are a few examples of what we learned from the survey respondents. And then in our initial focus groups, we had kind of a similar focus on safety, although safety meant a lot of different things to different people, right? So there is bike safety, like I'm afraid of my bike getting stolen, right? There is safety on the streets. I'm afraid of getting hit by a car. There is just a wide array of meanings of safety for people, safety at night, safety during the day. So safety came up in a lot of different ways. Having active transportation that was more accessible or that they could connect more easily to was important. Having programs and attractions, things to do, was particularly important for those living in the core or those who might be unhoused, who are part of our focus groups, and also making sure that our basic human needs are met. So that's things like shelter. Do you have shade in the winter, or not shade in the winter? I suppose it's shelter in the winter, but shade in the summer. Do you have water if you need access to water to drink while you're moving around throughout the city? Do you have access to a bathroom? Do you have access to seating if you need to take a break? So when we talk about basic human needs, that's what we're talking about. And so these are some of the quotes from the focus group that really kind of emphasize the need for programming and activities, and we need to activate our public spaces. It's not just about having our spaces there, it's also about the way that we use them and program them. And this is a picture from the Riverbank Discovery Center on Sunday when I was actively using this space with my friend's daughter, and we had a great time skiing. And they now have, I think, 20 kilometers of trails, although the snow hasn't cooperated as well as I would like it to. I think it really speaks to this latter point of like, active transportation is all year round, public space is all year round. We need to be able to do it even in the winter time. And this, interestingly, is a quote coming from our newcomer focus group, right? Like, I find this miserable, but my kids love this snow, and you know, I would like it if we could have a winter festival. So we took this information to a workshop in Copenhagen, and we were joined there by the city of Saskatoon, Guelph, and Oshawa. Really interesting combination, not like huge cities. Interesting to have a city like Oshawa there that's like a GM town, like literally built around the idea of a car. And so we had some interesting discussions about trucks and cars and parking with them. And so this is a workshop that was actually put on by a Toronto-led non-for-profit called 880 Cities. And so 880 Cities, the name really speaks to the fundamental goal of this organization and the question that guides their work. And that is, what if we made cities great for people who are 8 years old and 80 years old? And by extension, everyone in between. And so you can see us there in the classroom. We had an opportunity to listen to experts, architects, city planners, researchers, and then really experience it for ourselves. Get out and do the cycling commute to all of our different workshops every day. So what did we learn from Copenhagen? Well, I think initially we think of Copenhagen as the bicycle city, but the bike is just a means to an end, right? Copenhagen is really good at putting people first. And that means that they make places fun and easy to be in, right? And fun is not something that's frivolous. It's how you promote social connection. It's how you get people moving. It has a lot of positive health impacts. And so you can walk down the street and jump on a trampoline in Copenhagen. And you can see that, the swings are made for all kinds of people. They're not swings for children alone, only child size. They're made to be shared with everyone. This is a picture of one of the public spaces that we visited that was in a more ethnically diverse area. And one of the features of this public space was that they had integrated symbols from different cultural groups to try to promote a greater sense of belonging within this space. I'm not trying to promote IKEA here, but I thought it was really interesting when we met with the city planner and she was talking about IKEA coming to Copenhagen and how they were negotiating with IKEA. Well, you can sell things that basically someone can bike home with or can be delivered to them. You can't have a big parking lot and you have to give back. And so giving back was constructing a green roof on the top of IKEA, which you can kind of see, that had to be accessible to everyone beyond store hours. So what if, we demanded that kind of reciprocity, that, many actors take ownership in this idea of making public space and making spaces that are healthy. I thought that was really cool. And I remember Dr. Freikotis saying, reciprocity, this fits really well with what we're learning from First Nations communities. How can we do this kind of stuff? They also set a lot of standards and they continually assess how they meet those standards and when they don't meet those standards. And then they adapt. They make this information public. They share their data and they do a lot of temporary trials so that we would see like pictures of like big trees that they had put out in kind of baskets. And they set up a new path or walkway and they collect information. They see what the public thinks, and then they iterate. They try to improve upon it, right? And they have these counters where they're collecting how people are actually using these spaces, right? And this is one of their lovely bike stops, just so you can see what does it look like when you have so many cyclists at a stoplight. They keep this, I said they make this information public. They have every 2 years since 1996 published what's called the bicycle account. And that's where they capture, how many people travel by bike. They capture severe injuries. We had a good conversation as academics about how do they measure severe injuries. I think even just the fact that the information is out there gives you an opportunity to question whether or not this is the right measure, but important if it isn't, that we can have a dialogue about that. And they also capture perceptions of safety. What I think is really interesting is that Copenhageners don't cycle because they're morally superior human beings, right? They do it because it's easy and fast, right? They're no better than you or I. There are questions about how much does this being environmentally friendly impact your choices? And that is the last choice, right? People do not make that choice for the environment alone. We need to make moving something that's easy and affordable, right? These are the things that motivate us. I also thought one of the compelling stories that we heard in Copenhagen was that their decision to kind of chart a different path and invest more in public space and invest more in active transportation was really out of necessity. And we kept hearing this pattern over and over again. We also went to Malmo, Sweden, and it was like, oh, we hit rock bottom. And so we decided that we had to do something different. And so Copenhagen was in the 1980s approaching bankruptcy. You had businesses pulling out. You had middle income kind of families leaving the core to try to find better places to live, better places to raise their family. This is a familiar story in many cities, whether it's Canada or the United States or elsewhere around the world. And they made a decision that in order to keep people, they had to make it affordable and fast and easy to get around, but also to invest in public space. And so even things like their waterfront, which was very industrial, very polluted, they've invested in infrastructure to encourage people to actually use that waterfront. And so you would literally see, well, while we were there, and we got to participate one morning in an early morning cold dip. I didn't stay in very long. But you would see people on their way home from work take off their suit and go for a jump. They also have different conventions around public nudity than we do. But I thought it was great that, there's this magical story of turning things around, but it didn't happen overnight, right? It happened through setting these standards, measuring it, seeing how you're doing, and changing it over and over again until you make it better. So rather than see Copenhagen as this like magical place that everyone wants to go and visit, I think this story really put into perspective that great things can come from rock bottom. And of course, we didn't just hear about Copenhagen being led by a Canadian nonprofit workshop or Canadian nonprofit. The workshop had a lot of information about Canadian cities trying their own interventions. So this is the Danforth, and they're just painting a bicycle path, relatively affordable intervention, something that they did and collected some information about, and then actually made a permanent intervention. Right? They found out that this was something that would work, right? Or what were some of the problems with it? How many people used it? When did they use it? How did they use it? And then we also saw some interventions that were more focused on public space rather than active transportation. And this one here, trying to remember the city, and I'm blanking on it right now, whether it's Brampton or Waterloo. But they took a square that was really unused. They put down some turf. They actually had like a little climbing wall. And what was really interesting was that this little climbing wall structure was most used by people between the ages of like 30 and 40 who don't have a lot of fun play things to do outside, right? And so I found that really interesting and also great to see that, we can have fun and use our public spaces. And that really got us thinking about how can we take these examples back. There are other Canadian cities that are doing this. This is not just a unique Scandinavian example, although as a health geographer, I will acknowledge that there are differences in composition and context, right? We're always talking about like, who is the population, like who lives there, what makes that different, and what is there? Well, we have different weather extremes. We have, in some ways, our city isn't as old in terms of having the history and architecture, but it's actually older from a demographic perspective. Copenhagen's quite a young city demographically. We are much more culturally diverse city in Canadian cities generally, right? We have a large Indigenous population, a growing newcomer population. And so it's really important to recognize that we can't just plunk and play, right? We have to listen to people. That's why we started by listening to people. So we came back and we met with groups. And that is something that has taken place really in the last month. is kind of sharing what we learned in Copenhagen and saying to people, how do you think this fits here? Or is there anything that you've learned from this presentation that you think we could do in Brandon? You know, what would make you want to bring an older adult here, a kid here who's 8 years old? What would make you have fun here? And so we collected a lot of information about programming ideas across all groups. You know, people really want to see art in public spaces. People also really want to see food, both as programming and just as an opportunity to share culture and connection. Sometimes they mention having local vendors. Sometimes they mentioned green space and gardening, having sort of like incredible edibles that already exist, but having more of that kind of gardening that allows people to also find nutritious, healthy food. And then emphasis on kind of meeting people's basic needs through seating, having access to water, a place to wash your hands or go to the bathroom. And then again, coming back to this idea of safety, what would make things safe? And people know that what would make things safe is safety in numbers, right? We find safety in a crowd. We find safety when there are other people around us. It's the kind of classic Jane Jacobs eyes on the street idea. We don't necessarily find safety through policing. We find safety actually by being together with others and making sure that that space is kind of constantly used. So those are some of the things that we're hearing, and we started to focus in on a particular space downtown that we could actually activate throughout the summer. And so one of our plans is to take the feedback that we have heard and to actually run a short intervention for the summer, collect some information and see how we can make it better, you know, learning from the Copenhagen example. We have also been able to be engaged in some planning around different cycling lanes. So for example, 26th Street is already scheduled for reconstruction in 2024. And so if you're interested in learning more about a cycling path on 26th Street or being engaged in the development of that, there are a number of public open houses that you can attend this month. So I just thought I would share that information. And I'm really excited that there are other plans and I think funding in the budgets to come for more bike paths to get people moving, recognizing that 26th Street is a great opportunity because it already needs to be reconstructed. And it's actually a street that I believe experiences as much traffic or maybe as little traffic as 6th Street. And so it's actually over capacity, and we have this opportunity to change it and to help people move. But we need a network, right? Not just a single road. So it's something it's going to take time, right, to build. But we've had this great opportunity to learn from world leaders and hopefully put some of that into practice. So just a bit about our project timeline. It's been a while now. We've been doing this for over a year, and we've just finished up the focus groups. And so our plan is to start that implementation of public space intervention in May. Hopefully the weather is good, and to collect some information and share that in the fall through a sort of unconference. So no stuffy lecture halls. We want to get you outside to learn more and share what we have been able to learn. So I want to emphasize that this project is just kind of riding on the coattails of great work that's already happening, right? There are already people in this room who have been building public spaces that are exciting places to be in with other members of our community, right? This is not something that our project necessarily is doing on its own. We're just taking this opportunity to try to connect the dots, if you will, and hopefully identify some champions that can help us to move this kind of work forward through small-scale pilots initially, and then hopefully building something larger and better through collecting data and ensuring that we continue to hear the voice of different groups, especially those groups who often don't benefit from these kind of public space and active transportation initiatives. So I think I'm on time, but that is it for me. Please defer your questions to Jeff, Mayor Jeff. No.
Thank you very much. Just before we get to the, oh, my mic's not on.
Oh, I guess I have to keep mine on.
Just before we get to the questions, I was going to plug the 26th Street bike because I just learned about it today from Doug Ramsey. And there's going to be a town hall on the 20th at the Keystone Center at 6, I believe, 6 to 8. And you can, there? Yeah.
I'm not
There
very
you
good
go.
at this.
There's a couple there.
So Keystone Center on March 20th from 4 to 8 p.m. and April 4th at Vincent Massey from 6 to 8.
6 to 8. I got the time mixed up with the place. And there's also a website on the City of Brandon's website. There's a page on the City of Brandon's website where you can actually look at a couple of the different plans and you can select which one you like and then put a couple comments. So go on the City of Brandon website and look for that. I'm really excited about this idea. Second of all, I went on your Facebook site a couple times and I commend you for wading through some of the vitriol and conspiracy theorists about 15-minute cities and things like that was on there. So
Grant. Grant really gets excited about those people actually in a weird way.
I couldn't believe some of the stuff I read on there. It's quite eye-opening actually. So any questions? Before you ask a question, I'm going to bring you a microphone. Any questions for Dr. Herron? Francis usually has a question. I'm surprised Francis didn't.
Turn it off. Christopher Alexander, the architect, wrote the pattern language, looked at patterns of movement that lead to human well-being over various scales, from the home to the landscape. And he looked at patterns of movement, exactly what you're talking about, within a city that make it the easiest way to move. There's like kind of interstitial pathways. And when I first saw them, they looked to me a lot like biological patterns, such as Dr. Rutherford and restoration of ecosystems looks at. And in hoping to make healthier ways of moving or more ecologically aware ways of moving the easiest way, so people simply just want to choose that, and then they reap all those benefits. Is it feasible to restore kind of interstitial spaces of the city, these abandoned places that already are a network? It's not a beautiful network, but this network of abandoned space exists. Is it feasible to restore those for our own human habitat?
I think so. What I'm hearing is sort of like people aren't that much different from, you know, other living organisms, and we're trying to be efficient in our movements. And can we restore kind of that kind of traditional ecology? I don't know. I want to say yes. I think part of, like, methodologically, part of how we look at like restoring easier movement is actually just observing how people do move, because people are already trying to find the easiest, shortest route to get places, right? And then kind of using that information to build a better system. And sometimes that means they're moving efficiently through cars, but we can also find other ways to kind of cut through, or, you know, see where people are cutting through and not using vehicles. So I hope that answers.
Other questions? Oh, all the way, or are you going to make me actively move? Okay, put it up,
how
just
do you
put.
define-
There you go.
How do you define, how big does a public space need to be? Should we be putting infills on every empty lot? Because that's where the kids are playing.
How big does public space need to be? I think we learned a lot about even like edge space when we were in Copenhagen, right? Like this importance of just like, what is the small front space in front of a business, right? Like, I don't think it has to be big, right? We just have to make sure that it's defined in a way that kind of like, public space is such a fascinating concept because on the one hand, it's something that's sort of like our cities or municipalities play a role in kind of setting the parameters around it, but then they are kind of just hands off, right? Like people make it, right? They, govern some of the rules around it. And then it's up to people to kind of take it back. That's what's so cool about public space. And it can make it very contested, right? Because different groups can claim it for very different purposes, and sometimes they don't agree. But as long as they're working within kind of the broad parameters set by our city, it's all fair game, right? So it doesn't have to be a big space. It can be a small space. I
Other
think
questions from the floor? Are there any questions online there, Pam?
Chair question.
Oh. We'll see if Pam has any questions on. So those of you online, please put your questions in the chat because we don't have any speakers for you. Nothing there? No? Okay. Francis, is that who you're?
Thank you so much. The topic walk the walk is smaller series. And when you were chatting the different path, you made mention of narrowing it so small city in Brandon. And I'm coming from Nigeria, where if someone maybe resort to using bike might be seen as as a kind of a low-level person. If you go in Nigeria, maybe as you get where you are and you ride bicycle, we see like a person that maybe you're like you don't have means of movement and all that. And as a member of the academy, I want to ask, what role can education and advocacy play in promoting a culture of walking and active participation in smaller urban communities? So by the time I go back home, I'll have that in my
Thanks.
academic.
that's a great question. It's a great question. And also, I really appreciate you sharing the context, kind of like socioeconomic context of what does it mean to ride a bike, in Nigeria for you. And I think Copenhagen, when we were in Copenhagen, they shared a lot of examples of how they use public education to promote cycling as something that everyone can do. So that can be working with kids and having a bicycle rodeo, where you're teaching kids about the rules of the road and how to safely cycle. And you're also encouraging kids from diverse backgrounds to engage with this mode of transportation as something that's for everyone. So maybe addressing this potentially stigmatizing view of the bicycle, right, as a way of getting around. And then they also have a lot of days, or I'm trying to remember if it was a month or weeks, but where they're really promoting biking to work as well. So having these kind of public campaigns and also working within the school system, I think are really effective ways. And I don't know whether this is normal now, but when I was a kid, we had a bicycle rodeo. I learned a lot about how to ride my bike. And then I rode my bike to school, which was actually a long way because I lived in the country on a farm, right? But it was seen as something, my parents thought it was safe. And I was excited to do it because I had learned about it at school and other kids in my school were able to do it. So I wanted to do it too. So I think there's a big role for sure in terms of education and promotion.
I think the stigma of bikes too is interesting because when I was in Amsterdam last year, which is probably similar to Copenhagen, everyone here has to have a fancy new bike,
Great point.
right? Whereas when I was in Amsterdam, they're just very ordinary one-speed bikes that look like if someone had them here, they would throw them in the trash. And everyone just rides, and you don't really see a lot of really souped up fancy bikes, but that's all you can buy in the stores here.
So we have this polarization here of like people who have no other means of transportation often have crappy bikes, and it's associated or seen as this low socioeconomic activity. And then people who are more affluent, right, have the $2,000 bike, and they're really like, that's the only bike you can have, right? Like it just doesn't make sense. And when we were in Copenhagen, they just had any bike.
Yeah, people in suits riding a one-speed handlebars up here bike. Yeah. So we got to cycle to our conference as well in Amsterdam. It was really cool. You have roundabouts where there's special lanes on the roundabouts for the bikes, and it was really, really amazing. Any other questions from? Yeah. Just put it up close here.
Rachel, you mentioned it sounds like you're looking to do a pop-up this summer. I'm wondering if you know yet what you're going to be doing and what's all involved.
Sort of. Grant, do you want to answer the question?
Well, we're really just getting started on that, but what we'd like to do is take that sort of an interstitial space, at 9th and Princess. It's a vacant lot. It's been vacant since the hotel came down 6-7 years ago. It's used, but it's used by people who are cutting through it to get somewhere else. So we'd like to make it a space where people can linger that might attract some people to it without interfering with the way people are already using it. We're sensitive to people who are, it could be a shortcut that's valuable for people. And if we put a big stage in the middle that's only used for 1 weekend or 2 weekends of summer, that becomes an impediment or something that annoys people. So what we're looking at is something that's a little bit more transient, and of course wouldn't interfere with potential future development of the space, which is the ultimate home. But that would encourage people to spend time there. So we're looking at a labyrinth or some other kind of like spiral perhaps that is laid directly on the ground. So it doesn't, you could walk through it if you wanted to, but it would encourage you to stop, to explore, to mindfully be in the space. And so that could just be painted on the gravel and the grass that's existing there. It's very, very cheap, and you can bring to it whatever you want without us forcing anything into that. Some solar lights maybe to make it accessible at night. We were looking at some interpretive signage that help people. One of the things we heard from the focus groups is people want to know more about the land and the history of the land, the place where they are. So that could be some wildlife, that could be vegetation, that could be history of the people who lived here and still live here. Flags of some of the newcomer groups that have come to Brandon to make them. So lots of opportunity, and we're going to launch that in May for International Labyrinth Day. Is that what we discovered?
What day is that again?
International Labyrinth Day.
Don't you know?
Thanks, Grant. So I think one of the things we realize there's so much learning. We want to start with a small intervention, but keep building on it. And I think the downtown became, an area that we wanted to focus on as we came to the end of our time in Copenhagen. And we looked at some of the things other cities we were doing, and we thought about, what matters for us, what are some of the priorities we need to address. We focused in on that area, but then we also have these other things that are happening, right? Like 26th Street. And so slowly we will hopefully see ways to apply this learning in a range of different areas. Do you want to speak?
Oh, just I'm gonna give you one of these.
The Honorable Mayor Jeff, speak.
Yeah, right on. So this is interesting. I like what everybody said. I like what you said there, where we do try to do those things. You get discussions between engineers and planners, and you can really see how those go. And so we do have to try to adapt that, because where are natural places that people go, and how do you make that fluid? So that is always ongoing discussions. Things like for small spaces, as you were speaking there earlier, a big difference, and you can't cut and paste like the Copenhagen to Brandon or a lot of other places. And one of the biggest things, so my friends that I was there with as well, mayors of Saskatoon and Guelph and them, then we would immediately all notice, okay, well, accessibility and liability seem to be very different in Copenhagen than they are in Brandon. You know, like as we'd look at that, "Hey, this is awesome. Oh, could you eat? No, we couldn't. No, we couldn't do that. We couldn't do that. We couldn't do that. Because accessibility would not have us to be able to do that, and liability would prevent us from doing that. So like, those are big things. Like I say, a small thing like a small space, which we're trying to work where you can have a couple of chairs and tables out front of a restaurant, say downtown, which we do have wide sidewalks. But we also have laws around accessibility and liability that work against us. Like they make it very difficult for us to do that. So while we're enjoying it somewhere else, we have our own government sometimes gets in its own way. So how do we work around some of those things to make it work? And then I did like also this comment as well, because it is true. The bikes and the transit and that they're like the subways of New York. They were the great equalizer in places like Copenhagen. Everybody is using them. And around here it is
A polarizing, you
and
either
we talked
use
to
it because you have
we
to.
talked to the bikes. There's Ryan Nickel, who did go with us and does ride his bike and walk to his job at the city all the time. He does have a really crappy bike. Like he has a Canadian Tire crappy bike, and he rides it for purpose. It gets him to and from, and but it was, as Rachel said, fast and easy. That's what it was cheap. It was the cheapest way to get around, and it was the most convenient way to get around. And we often try to market it differently. We market it as you'd be a better person. You know, well, they'll be a better person if you make it fast and cheap. So we do need to come up with those things, and then not
Yeah.
self-righteously kind of push it on people, but
Yeah,
everyone did, and it was and you know, I've spoke to the local bike places, like, can you bring in cheap bikes? And I would argue myself often, although I do winter ride, you know, we do like the Copenhagen's like Vancouver. You know, as we said, well, we saw lots of pictures of them biking in the snow. And they'd say, oh yeah, they take a lot of pictures that day. And but really, unfortunately, and if you drive on our streets right now, you'll see our winters are not what they used to be. Like there was a handful of days that if you were riding to a place or back, you could have done it all winter long. So things are changing. We're very conscious of the fact that as the bikes get cheaper with the batteries and that becomes a very practical way, an inexpensive way of getting around. You just have to feel safe doing it.
and
So,
there was
yeah,
a
these are good
surprising number
discussions.
of people, even in the survey, who already had e-bikes and talked about using their e-bike, like for,
Yeah, but $5,000 right now is one
Yeah.
thing, and then because
Yeah.
we would just, as you do, you leave your bike, you leave it outside, you know, put a little lock on it and you leave it and you walk away. You don't do that around here.
Yeah, they have the locks built into the back wheel there where you don't have
Yeah.
to have a big lock you carry around, just it's on the bike and you unlock it and lock it.
yeah.
But for those that have been in Brandon a long time, we historically, like we did, I don't know who's been here, probably me the longest, but our white bikes, like we had white bikes for, you were around for white bikes? Yeah. Where we took all the old police stolen bikes, painted them white, and you could just ride them wherever you wanted in the city. So we had it for a few years and then they all got stolen back. But the concept has always been there, how to do that. So
I think the other thing you brought up that I should speak to as a limitation is that we really haven't engaged from an intersectional perspective as much with people who are living with a disability in this project. So while we have engaged with older adults, many of the older adults, for example, that we've engaged with are very active seniors, very resistant to being called seniors, some of them. And so I think that's a real limitation. Like when we set out, we'd really hoped too that we would also include those people who are using a wheelchair in these discussions about public space and active transportation, and we haven't really been able to reach them. So I think that's a gap in terms of how are we actually trying to build these spaces so they are truly inclusive for everyone. We heard some feedback about it, but not from people who are themselves in a wheelchair.
I think COVID was you couldn't buy a bike during COVID, right? So I think that was a big boost, particularly to the e-bikes. I was thinking about your liability. I've put a trampoline up in the middle of downtown Brandon.
We would run and jump on it, and oh, we can't do this at home. It's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And we asked them about that. And, our colleagues, told them, yeah, we'll probably look at that. All that,
Yeah.
even, cobblestone, everything, yeah, that's something that probably look at.
Is liability the reason that the kids' wading pools have been pulled out? I watch them with those fancy water structures. They do it a few times, they get bored. But the wading pools, they're actually learning to swim a little bit. They're about 18 inches of water. And they love it. They stay in there for hours.
There was liability.
It's liability, yeah.
Okay, well, it's just a little bit past 3:30, so I think we'll wrap up. Thank you again to Dr. Herron.